The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. And they shall seek to the idols, and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, said the Lord of hosts.
New showdown and fears of a potential civil war brewing in Egypt today. At least 7 people, including an American college student, have already been killed in violent anti-government protests, all on the 1-year anniversary of President Mohamed Morsi's inauguration. And this situation could all boil over just hours from now. ABC's Alex Marquardt is in Egypt with the very latest. Hi, Alex.
Good morning, Paula. Cairo is bracing for what are expected to be massive and likely violent protests against President Mohamed Morsi. These protesters down here on Tahrir Square, which, as you know, is the birthplace of the revolution, are now loudly calling for a second revolution. Even before the main protest began, there have been 2 days of violent clashes between supporters and opponents of President Morsi. Many of those who fought side by side 2 years ago to oust the longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak are now fighting each other. Liberal opponents of Morsi say he's trying to impose his Muslim Brotherhood values on the country, that he's done nothing to rebuild it. The opposition has now been joined by their old enemies, supporters of Mubarak.
We are looking to have a better life, more democracy. We don't want any more the Muslim Brotherhood. We are not convinced with Mohamed Morsi, and we're going to stay on the street until he leaves.
An umbrella opposition group called Rebellion claims to have 22 million signatures, a quarter of all Egyptians, on a petition calling for early elections. They also accuse the United States of backing the Muslim Brotherhood, while the Brotherhood says the U.S. is siding with their opponents. Around 150 people have been wounded since this new wave of protests began on Friday, and 7 people killed. Among them was 21-year-old American student Andrew Proctor. He was caught in a violent protest on Friday where he was stabbed. Proctor's family said he was in Egypt this summer to learn Arabic and teach English to children, and eventually wanted to move to the Middle East. President Barack Obama says the U.S. isn't taking sides and has called for calm today. But in signs of the violence that could come, the U.S. Embassy has closed today. President Morsi has moved his family for safety. Many here are afraid that Egypt is on the cusp of civil war.
And now back to our other top story on the Sunday morning, those historic protests that, as you can see, are right now ongoing in Egypt. There are new calls for President Mohamed Morsi to step down. This just 1 year since that country held its first free elections following the overthrow of former President Hosni Mubarak. Well, the demonstrations pit millions of Egyptians against their Islamic leader. Is this a people's revolution against Islamic rule? John Bolton is the former United States ambassador to the United Nations and Fox News contributor who joins us every Sunday at about this time. Good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning, Eric. Glad to be with you.
Why do they want Morsi to go?
Well, there are a lot of reasons that the demonstrators have, and sometimes they're conflicting with each other, so that while the pictures on the surface look a lot like the demonstrations against Mubarak and Tahrir Square 2 years ago, I think it would be a mistake to assume that we're simply seeing a repeat. The fact is the Muslim Brotherhood government has not performed in a competent fashion, so you have a lot of people who actually long for a return to the stability of the Mubarak years. You do see some people who want a Western-style democracy. You see some people who are opponents of the Brotherhood because they don't think it's Islamicist enough. So I think there's a very real risk here that Morsi's supporters, who are also out demonstrating today, could come into physical conflict with these anti-Morsi demonstrators. We've already seen violence on both sides. This really could spin out of control.
And what happens if, as you say, potentially it could spin out of control?
Well, many of the demonstrators, the anti-Morsi demonstrators, make it very clear they want to show such instability that the military is forced to intervene, basically to oust Morsi and call new elections. And that's why I think some people mistakenly view the demonstrators as representing the pro-democracy forces. But it's if you look at the actual results of the elections, while Morsi himself won only narrowly, Islamicist legislative candidates won, depending on how you count it, 2/3 or 3/4 of the votes for the parliament. So this turbulence in the streets is really very complicated and in that respect significantly different from the anti-Mubarak demonstrations that we first watched in Tahrir Square.
And Morsi says he's not backing down. In fact, he just met the other night with more of his Islamist backers. They do have in the Islamist-inspired constitution some religious authority paragraphs and dictums, and he says, well, they may revise those. Will that be enough to quell this sense against him?
I kind of doubt it, but I think where the anti-Morsi demonstrators are miscalculating is that Morsi has also done a significant amount of reshuffling of the Egyptian military. So if the military did come in, it would not necessarily be against Morsi, it could be against his opponents. And that could spell the end of this democratic experiment in Egypt. As many people predicted, that the Muslim Brotherhood believes in the saying, one person, one vote, one time.
Yeah, that's different and quite a contrast to last time when the Egyptian army helped usher out Mubarak and ensure some type of stability.
Yeah, that's why I think looking at these demonstrations, superficially, of course, they look a lot like the anti-Mubarak protest of 2 years ago. But I think politics in Egypt have gotten a lot more complicated. Nobody should underestimate the support that the Muslim Brotherhood has, notwithstanding that the Morsi government has done little or nothing, for example, to overcome Egypt's economic problems. The support for an Islamic government has been reflected, as I said, in the votes in the parliament. And these people are not going to see Morsi pushed out just by this sort of demonstration.
So far, 7 people have been killed. And, Ambassador, we have the heartbreaking case of the junior from Kenyon College in Ohio, Andrew Proctor. He was 21 years old. He was there to teach young Egyptians English. His family said he cared profoundly, was there for peace and understanding. And so heartbreakingly, he gets stabbed to death by a protester. How do we honor his memory? How do we honor the idealism of young Americans when something like this happens? So potentially the right thing happens in Egypt.
Well, I think it's obviously a tragedy. I think it highlights for us that other Americans in Cairo and other major Egyptian cities could be at risk. The demonstrators who proclaim their support for democracy may be sincere in what they're saying, but they're surrounded by other people who couldn't care less about democracy. So I think the idealism of young Americans like that needs to be tempered with some caution in a very, very volatile and dangerous situation.
It is very volatile. We'll stay on it throughout the rest of the day here in the Fox News channel, of course, as it develops. Ambassador John Bolton, thanks so much for joining us, as you do always on this Sunday.
Thank you, Eric.